Hey guys, I am back with the Hardy Boys, the Great Airport Mystery, and we are on chapter 3, The Ghost Pilot. The next morning, after the doctor had assured Mr. Hardy that the boys were fit, the detective and his two sons proceeded to the Stanwide Mining Equipment Company for a meeting with Mr. Allen. Soon they were being ushered into a spacious paneled office. A graying, distinguished-looking man arose from behind a desk and extended his hand in greeting. Mr. Hardy introduced Frank and Joe. After handshakes, Mr. Allen gestured for all of them to take a chair. The tall executive studied the boys for a moment, then glanced at Mr. Hardy. "I've already made arrangements for your sons to be hired as summer employees for our firm." "Good," Mr. Hardy answered. "I'm convinced that this is the only way the case will be solved, by someone working on the inside." "Our posing as employees," Frank spoke up, "will allow Joe and me to investigate without anyone becoming suspicious." "I hate to think that any of my employees may be mixed up in this," Mr. Allen said with a sigh. "However, I'll do anything to help clear up the mystery." "Dad tells us that most of the shortages are of parts that contain platinum," Joe remarked. "That's correct," replied Mr. Allen. "It's understandable, too, for they would be the most valuable." "Where do you obtain your platinum?" Frank queried. "We purchase it in large quantities from a firm in Canada." As they discussed the case, Mr. Allen noticed the brothers glancing at the strange voodoo figure mounted on the wall. "I see you boys are interested in my little curio," he said. "Yes, we are," Frank admitted. "The figurine is more to me than just an ornament," Mr. Allen said sadly. "It is also a reminder of a tragedy that occurred several months ago." The Hardys listened intently as he related the story. His firm owned a subsidiary company known as Stanwide Research and Development Laboratories. Its function was to conduct exploratory mining work in various parts of the world. Recently, in an expedition that had been sent in one of the firm's aircrafts, the Isle de la Mer, a small uninhabited island far out in the Caribbean. During the return trip, the plane had developed engine trouble and crashed into the sea. Only the co-pilot, Lance Peterson, had survived. The pilot, Clint Hill, and 3 mineralogists had gone down in the sinking aircraft. Lance Peterson was now chief pilot for the company. "I considered Clint Hill not only a loyal employee," said Mr. Allen, "but also a close friend. It was Clint who sent me the figurine. I was shocked and grieved when he was lost." Mr. Allen sat silent for a few seconds, then came back to the case at hand. "Now about your employment," he said to the boys. "Your father asked me to select jobs that would give you as much freedom to roam around the plant as possible. I think an assignment as plant messengers would fit the bill." "That's perfect," Mr. Hardy agreed. Mr. Allen asked the boys when they would like to start. "How about tomorrow?" Frank suggested. "The sooner the better." Mr. Hardy informed his sons that right now he and Mr. Allen were going to examine the firm's employee files for possible suspects. He suggested that in the meantime Frank and Joe become acquainted with the layout of the plant. Mr. Allen had one of his office clerks take the young detectives on a brief tour of Stanwide. Then they were introduced to Art Rodax, the man who was to be their boss. Rodax was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a soured face, belligerent expression. He seemed to develop an immediate dislike for the 2 new employees. "Factory messengers, eh?" he blurted out. "I don't need any more help." "But we've already been hired," said Joe. We start tomorrow morning." "Then I guess there's nothing I can do about it," Rudax growled. "But let me catch you lying down on the job just once, and you won't last a day." He was still grumbling when the boys left to return to Mr. Allen's office. "Boy," Joe exploded, "I'm sure glad we aren't really going to be working for that sour ball." "Me too," said Frank. "He'd be making a starving man lose his appetite." Mr. Hardy told the boys that his examination of the employee files would take longer than expected. Since Mr. Allen had offered to drive him home later, he suggested that his sons take the car and go now. "When I get home, I will let you know if I find out anything," the detective promised. "Okay, Dad," said Frank. "Joe and I want to stop at the airport on the way back to double-check with Lou at the tower on all of last night's flights." Light rain was falling, and a heavy prefrontal fog was beginning to move in as the Hardys arrived at the field. They walked to the tower and climbed the winding steps to the top. As they entered the control room, Lou Diamond, the tower chief, waved a greeting. A short, stocky, good-natured man with a crew-cut red hair. He, nevertheless, had an air of authority. "You boys picked a fine day to pay a visit," he said with a laugh. "In a little while that fog will be so thick you can walk on it." The Hardys peered through the tinted panes of glass enclosing the control room. Already the ramp area immediately below was vanishing in the milky fog. "We're not here just for a visit," Frank announced. "We thought you might help us by giving out some information." The young detectives then told the tower chief about their encounter with the low-flying aircraft the night before. "Were you able to identify the type of aircraft or get its registration number?" Diamond asked. "It was too dark for a positive identification," Joe replied. "Anyway, we were both busy ducking." Diamond looked thoughtfully. "Funny, I know of no private landing fields in that area." He paused. "There have been several strange things going on in the air around here lately," he said. "What kind of strange things?" Frank asked. "At night we've picked up messages between planes that must be in code. They sure make no sense." Suddenly a light flashed on the console and one of the radio speakers crackled to life. It was the unicom frequency used by flight students for practice and by pilots wishing to communicate with another in the air. "Bayport Tower, this is High Flight 14 Alpha." The pilot identified his craft using Alpha for A. "How do you read?" To the boys' astonishment, the tower's chief, normally ruddy face, turned pale. He picked up a microphone and then stood motionless, apparently unable to speak. Finally, in a quivering voice, he responded, High Flight 14 Alpha. This is Bayport Tower. Reading you loud and clear. This is 14 Alpha, not on an instrument flight plan. We are on top of at 13,000. Can you get us clear for an ILS approach at Bayport?" "Negative 14 Alpha," replied the tower chief. "Bayport is now below ILS minimums. Advise you contact air traffic control on the proper frequency." There was no answer from the aircraft. Diamond seemed to be under great strain. He placed the microphone on the table and mopped perspiration from his face. "What's wrong?" Frank asked anxiously. "The aircraft that just called? That identification number?" the tower chief said in a shaky voice. "What about the identification?" Joe urged. "That's the number of the plane once owned by Statewide Mining, the one that crashed in the sea several months ago." That surely is strange," Frank said, frowning. "I don't know what's going on," replied the tower chief, "but I'm sure of one thing. The pilot who just called sounded exactly like Clint Hill." Just then the radio speaker again crackled to life. A weird sound like a disembodied chuckle came eerily from it. Then a voice spoke. The dead can tell no tales. That is Clint Hill, Diamond murmured, looking like a ghost himself. What do you make of it? Frank asked. Only one thing, said Diamond in a frightened voice. I never used to believe in ghosts, but now I do. And that's the end of chapter 3. Join me again for chapter 4.